Great. All right. So today we have, or rather, if you go and look at Blackboard, you'll see that we are moving towards a subject that, on the one hand, is just a natural extension of what we've been doing so far. What we've been doing so far is looking at different ways in which might vary from each other and discussing how that might affect the prices or the interest rates of different kinds of assets. There it is. Now, one aspect in which assets might vary, well, we've looked at several so far. One was that they might vary in terms of risk. Another is that they might vary in terms of liquidity. But there's one other way in which certain assets might differ that we've not finished thinking about, though we did start to discuss it, and that is in terms of maturity. So what do I have in mind here? What I have in mind is, imagine two assets, let's say two bonds, that are the same in all ways, which to take literally means that the borrower is the same in both cases. But the bonds have different maturity. The classic case is going to be government bonds, for two reasons. One is that when the United States government borrows, it usually borrows, well, it's continuously borrowing more and more and more. So even if when the bonds were issued, they had the same maturity, the fact that they're issued at different dates means that they're going to expire at different dates. So you could buy a bond that's going to expire in a year, or maybe one that was issued 6 months ago, and so it's going to expire in 6 months. So that's one way in which bonds could be the same, except in terms of maturity. Another possibility, which is actually true, is that even when the bonds were issued, they had a different maturity. So the United States government borrows sometimes for 1 year. So it has a bond that it sold today for the first time that expires in 1 year. But there are also bonds that may expire in 2 years, 5 years, even 30 years. And so, as a result, you could do the following, at least for government debt, because again, there's so much of it, and the government borrows at different time frames, issues debts with different maturity. You could imagine doing the following graph. Remember that there are bonds of different maturities out there. They're being bought and sold, and using the present value formula, as soon as we observe that a bond has been bought or sold, we observe its price, know what its face value is, so we can figure out what the rate is, right? So you could imagine a graph where you plot on this axis maturity. I'm going to spell it out. It's this M here from this equation. And on this axis, the interest rate that's being charged on debt of maturity M. Now, you can actually get those numbers from the Wall Street Journal. They're published every day. And the government publishes that information as well. What you get when you draw this plot is something that's called a yield curve. Remember, yield is just another word for interest rate. So you'll get a yield curve. And these are very important things. What we're going to do over the next couple of weeks is learn something about what yield curves usually look like, learn something about why they look the way they do, and also learn why it is that so much attention is given to them. I'll tell you one reason which you may have heard of depending on how much economics you were doing over the past year or two, which is the following. I'll tell you one general fact about yield curves, which is that they usually slope up. So this is 0, this is 1, 2 years, 3 years, all the way up to 30. I think that's the longest. At some point, there were 50-year bonds. I don't think they're made anymore. So usually they slope up. In other words, for some reason, long bonds, long maturity bonds, high maturity bonds, tend to have higher interest rates than short maturity bonds. So one of the things we'll want to do is figure out why. Why is it that long maturity bonds tend to give higher interest rates than short maturity bonds? However, it's not always the case that the yield curve slopes up. In fact, sometimes, very rarely, they slope down. When they slope down, because usually they don't, that's sometimes referred to as an inverted yield curve, because it's pointing the opposite direction from the norm. Have any of you heard about the inverted yield curve? Because it's something that got a lot of discussion in the news over the past couple of years. Because, yeah, so Gene has. So in May of 2019, and then again, I think in February of 2020, there was an inverted yield curve. And Gene, do you remember why it is that people were concerned about this?
I don't really remember, but I think like longer term bonds were having higher interest, or the other way around. The longer term bonds had lower interest rates, and may I guess if it's because of inflation? I'm not sure.
So we'll discuss why the yield curve has a shape it does and so on later on. But the reason that people made a lot of fuss about the inverted yield curve is because historically, whenever you've seen one, there was a recession within the next year or two. Exactly. Nicholas has heard about this. Whenever there's an inverted yield curve, it's a warning sign that there's likely to be a recession in the next couple of years. So another thing that we'll want to do is to figure out why might that be. Why is the yield curve usually upward sloping? Although again, not always. Why in particular would a yield curve that slopes down be, as Nicholas put it, indicative of a recession? A recession that's somewhere on the horizon in the next couple of years. Notice that these last yield curves, the last yield curve inversions, were correct, weren't they? We're in the deepest recession since, I guess, the Great Depression, probably. So it seems to work. Keep that in mind going forward. You see an inverted yield curve, it's time to get worried. So we're going to spend a lot of time thinking about yield curves and what we can learn from them. But before we jump right into that, we'll first of all want to spend some time on some preliminary information that we need to have before we think about yield curves. One thing that we'll want to discuss is something that I guess we could have discussed earlier, but we gave it a pass temporarily, which is that we're talking about interest rates as being something that's determined in the markets. But of course, you've all been in macro classes, and so you know that aside from whatever happens in the market, there is another force that can affect interest rates, which is monetary policy. So one thing before we go to discuss the yield curves that I think is useful to have done first is to have had at least some discussion of how it is that monetary policy works and affects interest rates. We'll come back to it later in the second half of the class and talk about monetary policy in much more detail. The other thing I want to talk about is the idea of arbitrage. Because much of economic theory assumes something that can be called the no arbitrage theorem, which is basically that there should be no opportunities in the market to make money for sure. So that's something that I want to have a look at first. And rather than talk you through the logic of why there should be no arbitrage, I thought it might be useful to try something a little different, which is to see if I could put you into breakout rooms to discuss a sort of, let's call it, mini problem set that I've set up. So if you go into Blackboard, which you should be able to do without exiting the virtual classroom, if you go into exams, you'll see that at the top, there is a little sheet there called the Arbitrage worksheet.
And here is the Arbitrage worksheet. So let's get cracking. Question 1. Consider a bond A. It has a maturity of 1 year. Its face value is 112. And now we have the following information. The price of this bond right now is 100. What does this tell us about the interest rates? So how do we answer this? Well, we connect the price of something right now with the payment that it delivers later using the present value formula, where P is F, the present is the future, divided by 1 plus the implied interest rate. Now, what else do we know? We know that P is 100, and we know that F is 112. The thing that we don't know is the interest rates, but we can compute that fairly easily using algebra. So, divide both sides by 100 and multiply both sides by 1 plus I, and you end up with 1 plus I is 112 divided by 100, which of course is 1.12. And if we subtract 1 from both sides, we end up with I equals 0.12, which is the same thing as 12%. Excellent. Next question. Consider a different bond, B. It has the same risk, maturity, liquidity, and other properties as A, and its face value is also 112. The question is, would anyone pay more than 100 for this bond, and why or why not? you have the option of buying bond A for 100 or buying bond B for more than 100. And if they're identical, then why would you pay more for the same thing? So the answer is no. There is no reason why you'd pay more than 100 for this bond, because you could have a similar alternative, bond A, at the price of 100. Next question. Suppose you are a bond buyer and you actually have some of bond A right now. And you observe that the price of bond B is less than 100. How could you profit from this situation? Well, you could sell bond A for 100 and buy bond B for less than 100. The two things are identical in all ways, except in this example, we're assuming that the prices are different. And that means that you can basically make money for sure, because you're selling something for a price and buying what's essentially the same thing for a lower price. And that is what we call arbitrage, the ability to sell something and make money for sure, in this example, by buying back what's essentially the same thing for a lower price. Next question. If a lot of people did the same thing, what would happen to the price of B? Well, if a lot of people buy a thing, demand and supply analysis tells us that its price should rise. And remember, the key assumption here was that bond B is priced at less than 100. So what this is suggesting is that if it deviates below 100, then everyone will buy it, which of course is going to raise its price back towards 100. Next question. By this logic, what would the price of bond B have to be equal to? Well, it would have to be equal to 100, because any deviation from it means that either the buyers or the sellers adjust their behavior in such a manner that the price converges back to 100. And what would be the interest rate? Well, since the present value, the current price, and the future value, the face value, are the same for both A and B, that means the interest rate is the same, which is 12%. So this is a no arbitrage argument. The market should not allow you to make money for sure by, for example, being able to buy one thing and sell the same thing essentially at different prices. And competitive markets should eliminate such opportunities in the way we just discussed, through the forces of supply and demand. Finally, suppose there is another bond C which has the same risk, maturity, liquidity, and all other properties as A. Its face value is 224, double that of A. What would be the interest rate and the price on bond C? Well, there's several ways to look at it. The intuition, of course, is that bond C is the same as two copies of bond A. And so there should be no arbitrage opportunities between buying bond C and buying two copies of bond A. Taking that idea, let's say, again, using the present value formula, that P equals F over 1 plus I. In this case, the price of buying bond C, using our no arbitrage argument, must equal the price of buying two copies of bond A. One copy of bond A is 100, so two copies of bond A is 200. And that is equal to the face value, 224, divided by 1 plus I. And again, we need to solve this by multiplying both sides by 1 plus I and dividing both sides by 200 And of course, notice that we can divide the numerator and denominator by 2. And we end up with the exact same equation that we had before. And therefore, we have the exact same interest rate, which is that I equals 0.12, which is the same thing as 12%. So we see that having identical assets with different sort of face values actually doesn't really add anything. These assets are essentially identical because you can mix and match. You can combine one of the assets to make the other one, and so there should be no arbitrage opportunities there either.
So, question is, why do we want to think about no arbitrage theorems in this context? Why did I, or to put it another way, why did I bring this up now? The reason, going back here, is that this yield curve here, remember, it's a relationship between maturity and interest rates for government debt. This relationship is in some sense going to end up being a benchmark from which the prices of most other, or maybe even all other assets are going to be derived or will be linked to this. How is that? Well, if you think of the United States government, its debt is kind of special in that, of course, as we were discussing before, there is risk on any asset that you hold. There's interest rate risk, for example, the risk that interest rates in the future might change, which could affect the value of any assets that you're holding right now. But there's one risk that people think typically United States government debt does not face, and that is the risk of default. So no one really thinks that the United States is going to default on its debt. They will pay whatever it is that they've borrowed. And therefore, these interest rates are the interest rates on assets of a given maturity where there is no risk of that kind. So if you imagine a company that's borrowing, and if it's a company that you think is also unlikely to be what you call it, to be defaulting in the future, then this also tells you roughly what interest rate its debt should be having. Right? So as I was saying, this is kind of a the yield curve is kind of a benchmark for how other assets are going to be priced. And that's another reason why it's something that's very important. It's another reason why, as I mentioned earlier, the Wall Street Journal publishes this every single day. It's because if you worked in the financial markets, buying and selling assets to try and make money, the yield curve is going to be very important information for you. Okay, so that's why we want to talk about no arbitrage. In particular, well, okay, let's get back to that later. So, any questions, comments, thoughts about what the yield curve is, and or what role it plays, why it's important for people who work in financial markets? Yes, Pilar.
So how are you relating the lack of the U.S. government defaulting to the yield curve?
So suppose I were not the US government, right? And I am borrowing at maturity of 2, right? The interest rate so if I were a risk-free borrower, so I'm not going to default, then the interest rate that I should be able to get on the market should be this, right? Same as whatever the government gets. On the other hand, to the extent that I'm, let's say, riskier than the US government, I'm going to be somewhere above. If I'm really risky, I'm going to be able to borrow only at interest rate that's even higher. And so the gap of any given borrower between what interest rate they can get and the corresponding US government debt is actually a way of measuring risk. So that's one sense in which this becomes a useful benchmark. Yes, Marshall.
So are you saying that the interest rate for entities that entail more risk than U.S. government would not be lower than the rate that the U.S. government receives?
Right. And how much higher it is tells you something about how the market perceives the risk associated with holding those those particular assets.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure. Great. So that was one thing. Now, let me save this. Actually, wait a second. I think someone else raised their hands. Yes, Richard.
Could you explain the overall significance of the inverted yield curve one more time?
Sure. We will figure out later why it is the case, but inverted yield curves tend to be an indicator that the economy is about to enter recession in the next couple of years. Historically, I think there's maybe been, I think, if I recall correctly, all recessions in the United States since World War II were preceded by an inverted yield curve. And I think an inverted yield curve was only once observed when no recession appeared in the next couple of years. So it's not perfect, but it seems to be a very strong predictor of bad economic conditions emerging in the next couple of years.
And
certainly last year it was correct. Go ahead. Sorry.
I'm sorry, just following up. And is there why, I guess, like what specific reason is there for that?
So we'll actually spend at least a week trying to put together why it is that yield curves behave the way they do. And when we do, we'll be able to see very quickly, I think, why it is that inverted yield curves tend to be related. But a short answer would be that, okay, we know yield curves usually slope upwards, right? And intuitively, the yield curve should have two components. One is whatever it is that makes them usually slope upward. Maybe interest rate risk. The other is what you think interest rates are going to do in the future. If you think interest rates are going to rise, that's going to make your yield curve more likely to slope up. If you think interest rates are likely to drop in the future, then the yield curve is more likely to slope down. And you remember from last week, when do interest rates drop? Interest rates drop in recessions. So the short answer would be inverted yield curves are an indicator that people expect interest rates to drop significantly. And that usually happens when the economy is going to tank. Another thing, of course, that makes interest rates drop is if there's low inflation, right? And low inflation, again, usually coincides with recessions, although not always. So that's the short answer. The long answer would involve us figuring out why is it that yield curves usually slow up, and how are yield curves related in the way I described to the expected future path of interest rates. That's what we'll be discussing next week. Okay? Of course, another thing that affects interest rates, as we were discussing, is monetary policy. And we haven't discussed monetary policy yet, and that's what I thought would be a good thing to do now. So, monetary policy. So monetary policy is, well, to talk about monetary policy, we first of all have to think about who does it. In all countries, in most countries, there's an entity that we call the central bank. In the United States, it's known affectionately as the Fed. And what it does, among other things, is that it controls the quantity of money, how much money there is in circulation. So that's the first thing. And monetary policy is controlling the quantity of money that's out there. Question is, how do they do that? First thing is how they don't do it. They don't control the money supply by just printing large amounts of cash and giving it out. Rather, as you may remember from your macro from the past, the Fed introduces new money into the economy by buying something. So there's so much money in the world. If the Fed decides they want to increase how much there is, they don't just drop money from helicopters. What they do is they buy something. Of course, in the act of buying, they have to pay for it. And the moment of paying, they're introducing new cash or new money, broadly speaking, into the world. And guess what it is that they usually buy? The Fed usually buys government bonds. Symmetrically, if the Fed wanted to decrease the quantity of money, what they would do is sell something. Of course, in the moment of selling, someone has to pay them. As soon as the Fed is paid, that money is no longer in circulation in the economy, and it's gone. So the Fed can increase the money supply by buying bonds. The Fed can decrease the money supply by selling bonds. And of course, if the Fed is increasing the money supply by buying and selling bonds, intuition should tell you, well, that's going to affect the market for bonds, right? And might affect the prices of these things, and therefore might affect interest rates. So to see that, let's pick an example. Let's just assume that the Fed is increasing the money supply. How is that going to affect the market for bonds? Well, let's draw it. Here's the quantity of bonds, or whatever asset we have in mind, and this would be the price of bonds. And here's some supply curve. Here's some demand curve. So that's what the market was doing to begin with. And suddenly along comes the Fed and decides to increase the money supply. Now, if it's increasing the money supply, as we were discussing, that means they must be buying something. In particular, it's buying these bonds. So whatever the demand was before, now suddenly the Fed has stepped in and is buying these bonds as well. So the demand for bonds should shift to the right and is increasing. Now you can read straight off on this graph what that means about bond prices. That means that the bond price, as a result of the Fed's action, should rise. And finally, remembering again our old friend, the present value formula, if bond prices rise, what that means is that it's the same thing as saying that the interest rates have dropped. So one thing that the Fed does when it increases the money supply is that it's also lowering interest rates. And of course, that's important because interest rates, if the Fed can lower the interest rates on any particular kind of asset, of course, it affects the cost of borrowing for anyone who is involved in this market. It actually makes borrowing cheaper. And if borrowing is cheaper, it might stimulate spending. So this is how the Fed tries to actually control not just what's happening in financial markets, but the overall economy. Right now, you may have heard that interest rates are historically low, and that's because the Fed has been doing what it can to push them down to try and stimulate the US economy now that we're stuck in this recession. Okay, so that's the first thing. The Fed can affect interest rates by buying bonds, assuming its purchases of bonds are so large that they have an influence on the overall market. But now, remember, this is going back to the picture we had a few minutes ago. Remember that there are actually many different kinds of government bonds that the Fed could choose to target, right? They could target one-year bonds, they could target two-year bonds, they could buy 30-year bonds. The question is, which one does the Fed target? Well, suppose they spend all their monetary policy, suppose they decide to increase the money supply by buying only, let's say, 1 year or 2 year bonds. Well, then it would be pushing down these interest rates. Oops, for some reason, oh, I see, sorry. It would be pushing down these interest rates. Those are the ones that it's buying, but it might not affect the longer ones very much. But it also has a choice. An alternative would be, what if it for some reason decides that it wants to buy only long-term bonds? Then it could push down the high end, leaving the short end relatively unchanged. Right? So it all depends on which part of the financial markets the Fed decides that it wants to attack. Usually, historically, the Fed would usually buy short-term bonds, and there's a reason for that. It's because the Fed is usually trying to deal with a recession. Recessions usually last a year, maybe, or less, maybe not very long. 1 or 2 years is the kind of time frame that we have. And so the Fed usually, when it conducts monetary policy, is worried about the short end of the yield curve. And so they tend to buy short-term bonds. But what if you were facing a super deep negative shock to the economy, such as the Great Recession, the financial crisis of 2008, or the coronavirus crisis that we're in now? that is no longer a just normal recession, right? It's something that could last a lot longer and have much more severe impact on the economy. So in a severe economic crisis like that, your intuition says maybe the Fed would want to try and lower interest rates across the board, not just the short-term rates. And that's exactly right. Starting in 2008, the Fed started doing something that it hadn't done before, which was precisely this, to buy not just short-term bonds, but also long-term ones in large quantities to try and change interest rates across the board. Why is that important? Well, remember, we were just discussing that the yield curve is a benchmark against which other bonds might be, or other assets more generally might be measured. Again, so let's say if this is me, and this is my interest rate, this gap, which is sometimes called the spread, by the way, tells me how risky I am compared to the US government. If the Fed is, remember now, add to this the new element that the Fed actually has some control over the shape of the yield curve and different parts of the yield curve. That means that the Fed can affect not just the interest rates paid on government debt, but the interest rate paid by everybody else, because they are moving the whole yield curve, which is ultimately the benchmark against which everything else is measured in terms of risk and so on. So that's a pretty impressive power to have. And of course, that's why monetary policy is so important. That's why monetary policy is such an important thing to get right. Because if they get it wrong, again, they could be causing damage to everyone across the board. Any questions, comments, thoughts about this? Okay, if not, then there's just one last thing I wanted to suggest, which is that you may recall that we looked at financial markets in a different way. Remember, there was the market for assets that we just looked at, but there was an alternative view, which was to think of financial transactions in terms of the assets themselves, the promises of payment, but rather in terms of the dollars that are borrowed and lent. So for that, we would instead have our quantity be the quantity of dollars borrowed or lent. The price of a borrowed dollar is how much extra you have to pay to get it. And of course, that is the interest rate. So what if we look at it this way instead? Introduce some demand, introduce some supply. Our thought experiment here was that the Fed is buying, well, it's trying to increase the money supply by buying bonds. If they're buying bonds, where do they show up here? If the Fed is buying bonds, what they're doing is they're lending out more money, right? Whenever you buy bonds, you're providing funds to whoever, you're lending funds to whoever you bought from. So the way the Fed's action shows up here is that they are, by buying bonds, supplying more funds here to be borrowed or lent. And in this way of looking at things, again, what we get is that when the Fed increases the money supply, it lowers interest rates. The difference being that here we didn't have to do this intermediate step between figuring out, okay, what does the Fed do? What is the Fed doing to the asset price? And then what does that imply about about interest rates. Here we get to do it more directly. So either way is fine. Just that this one, I thought it was worth checking that we're getting the same thing whichever way we look at it. And of course, the answer is yes, we do. And finally, there is one more. There's a third way of thinking about how financial markets work and how interest rates are determined, which I feel I should mention to you, even though I'm not a big fan of this particular theory. Chances are, however, that you have seen it in another class. So I think I should mention it. It's called the liquidity preference theory. It's developed by Keynes. What liquidity preference theory does is that it says, look, suppose you have wealth. There are two things you could do with your wealth. You could stick it in, you could hold it as money, which is your preference for liquidity, or you could lend it to someone else, in which case you would earn some sort of interest. And in this theory, that tells you that interest is, in a sense, the price of holding money. Anytime you choose to hold on to money, you're giving up the interest rate. So what this theory does is it thinks not about the markets for assets, but essentially the markets for money. So on the x-axis, we have the quantity of money. On the y-axis, we have the opportunity cost of money, which is the interest that you are giving up. Why would you hold money? Well, you hold money because, well, you need it to spend, or maybe you're holding on to it in case of an emergency. But either way, since you're giving up interest whenever you're holding money, the idea is that how much money you want to hold is going to be low if the interest rate is very high, because it's costly to hold money. But, you know, as the interest rate goes down, the cost of holding money also goes down, so you would be willing to hold more of it. So connecting all of these dots, you end up with what in this theory is called the demand for money, MD, or money demand. Where's the supply? In this theory, the supply of money is whatever the Fed wants it to be. So in this theory, there's money demand that comes from our desires for holding liquidity. The money supply is just whatever the Fed decides it wants it to be. And in this theory, equilibrium interest rates are coming out from here. And the Fed just gets to pick whatever interest rate it wants by choosing the money supply. And of course, in this theory, it's straightforward to see that if the Fed increases the money supply, once again, as before, interest rates go down. I'm not a big fan of this because it seems to lump all the interest rates together into one. As we were discussing, the fact that there are bonds of different maturities out there means that there is no one interest rate. There's, in principle, almost a continuum of interest rates for different maturities, and the Fed actually has some power over all of them. Nonetheless, I guess this is a traditional and useful way of thinking about or remembering the fact that changes in the money supply may affect interest rates. Here, that relationship is entirely direct. Have you seen this before? You may not have seen it called liquidity preference theory, but chances are you've come across it in some micro class or other. I'm a much bigger fan of thinking of the market for borrowed or lent funds, or in terms of asset markets. Right. If you took intermediate macro, you surely have come across it. Any questions, comments? If not, why don't we just move on to our exit quiz. Get your devices ready. True or false? Municipal bonds are untaxed. Like if you earn interest on a municipal bond, you don't have to pay taxes on the interest. Does this mean that the interest rates should be lower or they should be higher? So it's true that municipal bonds are untaxed. The question is, does this mean their interest rates are lower or higher? Oh, great. Most of you got that right. Excellent job. Next. Question 2. When the Fed increases the money supply, what does it usually do? Buy or sell, and is it bonds or shares? That's a photo of the Fed, which is just a few blocks from campus. Excellent job. Sophia is number 1. Hilaria is moving up. All right. True or false? The chair of the Fed right now is Janet Yellen. What do you think? Is this true? Is it a trick question? Time's running out. She is not. She used to be, but she is no longer the chair of the Fed. She is now the Secretary of the Treasury. Next. When the Fed increases the money supply, what happens? Do bond prices fall? Do interest rates rise? Do interest rates fall? Or does GDP growth slow? And that's a picture of the US money supply. Looks pretty scary. Very good. Almost everyone got that right. This is one where you have to put things in order. The something curve for something bonds plots something on the x-axis and something rates on the y-axis. So again, pull each rectangle into its order, into the correct order, and when you're done, press the K at the bottom of your device, and that will submit your answer. Almost there. I think we're waiting on one more person. The something curve. Oh, very good. Excellent. Almost everyone got it right. Perfect. And last but not least, a warning sign that a recession is coming is when the yield curve slopes up, slopes down, is flat, or is squiggly. Very good. Almost everyone got that right. So let's see, how did we do? Gilad is in third place. Good job. Second place is Sophia. And first place it's Marshall. Very good. All right. Good job, everyone. So Marshall, you get to put a silly Snapchat filter on me. So what do you suggest?
I've done this a few times. I'll defer this opportunity to other people.
Okay, so Sophia is second. Any ideas, Sophia?
Give me 1 second to think.
Sure.
Maybe like fruit? Is there like
Fruits. Let's see. I can turn myself into a banana. Does that work?
Yeah, that works.
And if I move around, it seems that my skin flops. Okay, I lost my face. All right, excellent. Now I'm a banana. Here's another one. Now I'm a banana that's being eaten. That's even worse.
Oh.
And here I am a banana that's being eaten by a monkey. All right, everyone. Thanks very much. Hope that was useful. And, well, feel free to get hold of me anytime. Tomorrow I have office hours. If not, I'll see you on Wednesday. Have a great time.
Thank you very much.
Good to see everyone.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Sure. Bye.